Well, welcome everybody to today's meeting of the Audit Committee. Shall we start with apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. There's apologies for absence from County Councillor Sheila Woodhouse and County Councillor Peter Clark.
If I could just make sure we know who's here, people who aren't members of the committee. We've got Joy Robson, Head of Finance, on my left. We've got Dave Walton from Internal Audit down on the front, and Mark Howcroft from Finance at the front. Terry Lewis and Non Jenkins from the Welsh Audit Office. I believe we've got Mr. Hoggins from an official from the County Council over there on the left. Is there anyone else we need to identify? Is Mr. Richard Jones at the back? Matthew Gatehouse? Leslie Russell from Finance. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. I'll move on then to the next item, which is declarations of interest. I'm quite happy to take those as we go along, and then, unless anyone wants to speak now. The public open forum is our next item on the agenda. There are no members of the public present so far as I can see. So I'll just move on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of May. Has anyone got any comments or observations on the minutes?
Prepared to move them, Chairman.
Do we have a second? Quite a few. Any objections? Okay, we'll accept the minutes then as a correct record. Thank you. So we're going to go on now to the action list from the previous meeting. Okay, the first item I've got is a report detailing the youth service, including the zone and grant funding elements of the whole directorate review, to be presented to committee when the business plan is finalised. This note says due next financial year, unless someone wants to correct me. I presume that means now this financial year. I don't think we've got anything further to add to that. I think we're just waiting for that to happen. So, yes.
Yeah, we had email correspondence from Ian Saunders offering to attend the September meeting if members require that for further explanation.
Well, I think that would be a good idea. I think it was about the business plan, wasn't it, for the youth service? Or am I thinking? No, I'm thinking of no. That's right, isn't it? It's about how the youth service fits into the business plan. So if he was to come along and brief us on that, that would be useful. Okay, the next item I got also for the youth service, clarification before the business plan is presented concerning the £70,000 grant from the Welsh Government provided for youth services for the zone in Caldicot, and specifically what happens to that value if moved to the leisure centre, what responsibility there is to ensure that the amount remained with the council. Now, I know that Josh Klein has provided us with a response on this item. I think that happened on the 19th of June. Do we have any further outstanding queries? Yes, Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, we had a response from Josh, which wasn't the response I was expecting, but it's a very good response on what he did tell us. But my specific question was about the £70,000 grant, which came from Welsh Government, which went to the Zone Management Committee. And that went into the asset of the zone. My question was, should the youth service be moved to the leisure centre? What happens to the zone, and what happens to the asset which the community youth group actually owned? That was my question. As an incidental on top of it, I understand it's not going to happen in any case now, so maybe my question is invalid in that respect. But it was really, what happens to the value of that £70,000 as we had it from the Welsh Government if it's not being utilised or fully used what it was for? Mr. Robson might have some idea.
As I understand it, the youth service weren't able to send anyone today to answer any further questions on this, but I guess we can put your further question to them, and perhaps they could come up with, perhaps they'd like to send someone along next time as well. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, I think Ian's prepared to cover both points if he attends in September, if members are happy with that.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's good. Okay, thank you. Risks, especially about events, a matter for internal audit. There's going to be a follow-up review of events to be reported in September, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair. We're currently undertaking that follow-up review now with a view to making that report in September, yes.
Thank you very much. The anti-fraudery, bribe and corruption issue, the Employees Code of Conduct has now been circulated to the committee, I believe, so that action is done. Implementation, they're not actually audit committee recommendations, they're internal audit recommendations, but we were going to ask the Chief Officer of Children and Young Persons to provide details of measures taken to address the audit opinions. Do we have anything on that?
Not at
Mr.
this
Walton.
stage, I'm afraid, Chair. Andrew Wathen has said that he's prepared to take that forward with Will McLean now to get those outstanding responses and updated to you.
Okay, thank you. Again, about unsatisfactory audit opinions. The review of historic audit opinions, which will cover 2 years, will it not? That's due. It's a 6-monthly report, isn't it? When will the next one be due?
I understand from the work plan it's next due to be reported in January 2018. So it will be a little longer than 6 months on this occasion. I think that may be just to sort of smooth the work plan of the committee, perhaps, but it's on the plan for January 18.
Okay, thank you. Also on the implementation of internal audit recommendations, this was the issue about car parking income. I think we were originally given some wrong information about a number of the recommendations from internal audit and the decision or report that they weren't going to be implemented. I actually undertook in the last meeting to invite you to the meeting, which I didn't do that in writing formally because I wanted more detail about what the recommendations were. But you've kindly come today, Mr. Hoggins, so perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Certainly, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. The operational manager for car parking is unavailable today, but I believe I hope I'm sufficiently familiar with the service and what's happened with that service to be able to answer most of the questions and give you a reasonable update on where we are. I've checked over the action plan as provided by the internal audit report. I'd have to say that many of the recommendations do rely upon the investment in new equipment and new signage and various other matters, and perhaps I'll take you through that. Most of all of our equipment has been in place for 20 odd years, I believe, and is now largely obsolete. So a report was taken to Cabinet and approved some months ago for a complete review of car parking and to generate investment into the car parking service. So the major items within the report was the charging regime within each town and within each car park, what that should look like, in particular investment upon short stay, long stay and the like, but also an investment funds to use for additional signage and new machines and DDA accessibility, items such as that, where investment was needed within the car parks. Many of the recommendations within the report talk about signage, networking of machines, and improving the information arriving from those machines. The contract is out, and we are presently in what they call the standstill period. And we expect to be awarded in the next couple of weeks, and new equipment will therefore be programmed to be introduced thereafter. These machines will be networked. We will have real-time information coming back from them, and we will have better financial information coming back from each machine. At the same time, a program has been put together to renew large sections of the signage within the car parks and to do some further improvements around DDA access as well. Other aspects perhaps of note, I have the benefit of having the action plan in front of me, other members perhaps don't. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but I have got them. So other aspects within there of particular note is the procedure manual. The draft procedure manual is completed. Some of the detail will depend upon the type of equipment used and installed, and therefore will be adopted once we've got that equipment agreed. Each manufacturer will have different approaches, quite frankly, to how they may be managed depending on the actual equipment. As I say, the signage is programmed and funds are put aside for that. The machines will be networked. New payment methods. In each car park, we hope to have a variation on payment methods, be that card, be that phone, be that cash. So there will be different methods. It won't be on every machine, and it will depend on usage, but we will be having new payment methods. There was a particular issue raised around the demarcation of roles between the cash collector and the reconciliation of the actual cash collected. Under the existing system, that was less straightforward because of the way the equipment actually worked. When you took money from a cash machine, it provided you with a printout of the actual money which was within the box. However, that was then reconciled by a separate officer other than the cash collector. It's counted by the cash collector, reconciled by another officer. The new equipment will now give us electronic information because we've got a new cash counting machine as well, which will give us electronic updates on what cash is coming from each machine. And we believe that should be sufficient to address any concerns about demarcation on roles. I hope I picked up on the major issues which came through the action plan, but would pick up on any... One matter was in relation to annual inflationary increases on budget preparation. Now, I know the model prepared by the authority does tend to put in that an assumption in terms of increase, but obviously it requires us to increase the actual charge. And that doesn't happen annually, but does require a member decision to do so. And I believe our accountants are aware of that. Nevertheless, we do. So it is something we're aware of, but it is a matter which we'd raise with our accountants as and when budgets are being prepared. I believe I covered the main aspects, unless any colleagues wish me to pick up on anything else, Mr. Chairman.
Are you saying then that the internal audit recommendations have been dealt with by this new action plan, or no longer apply? Is that what's been happening? Because I think there were 9 recommendations that weren't implemented.
Yeah, just to reiterate, many of the recommendations relied upon new equipment. The equipment which we have in place is largely obsolete, quite frankly. They replace parts now by stripping down other machines. Our report to Cabinet created the new funds. That allows us to put in new equipment, new signage. That will address many of the concerns and many of the actions required within the audit report. And I believe I covered the other aspects outside of that.
Can I just check, is that how you understand it, Mr. Walton?
Yes, Chair. I think from our point of view, it's a case that at the particular moment in time when we revisited, there were a number of outstanding actions, but as Mr. Hoggins has outlined there, they are now being implemented over a relevant period of time and are in the process of being addressed.
Will there be a follow-up at all?
We will continue now in line with the public sector internal audit standards to monitor the implementation of all audit recommendations, and going forwards now we will be producing regular reports to committee on the implementation of recommendations across the authority. That will be part of that report, yes.
Okay, I'm just going to throw it open now to wider comments or contributions. Councillor Murphy.
Did that come on? Yeah. Straightforward question. Any idea on timescales for implementation now that the funds are available?
The actual tender, we went through a tender exercise to pick a supplier for the new equipment, and as I say, that's been out to tender. Tenders are in. It's in what they call the standstill period, 10 days, 12 days. 12th of July we can award. Don't hold me to this necessarily, but I think maybe 2 to 3 months before mobilisation at least to get it on site. Signage, similarly, we're organising that internally through the operations team. But again, I'm hoping that by the autumn we should be making some progress, at least in terms of implementing the new equipment. I'd need to take advice actually from Amanda as to whether or not it's a big bang theory where all has to be done at the same time, or whether we can do it incrementally. But we will be trying to get it in. I would hope to be some progress, at least within 3 months on it.
Are there any other comments or observations or questions? Well, then I consider this item dealt with, Mr. Hoggins. So thank you very much. Our next action was about 0 hours contracts, further information requested regarding staff at the museum service, Tinton Station, Shire Hall and Caldecott. We had a response on the 22nd of June about the museum service. I don't know whether we need further information about the other items mentioned. Councillor Easton, I know this started with you, so how do you see it?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, I received that email as well. The answer in there is, for what it answered us, for what it did answer, is comprehensive, but I did email Mrs. Barnard to say that we still haven't had anything on the other 3 establishments. That's the Shire Hall, Tinton Station and Caldecott Castle. I understand that the officer is on holiday at the moment and will be picking this up when she comes back, mid-June, mid-July sometime. Is that correct? So that's where we...
So we'll consider that ongoing. Councillor Murphy.
Just for information, Chair, there was a question raised at Council, a further question that looked for gender breakdown. That's actually being done. But in terms of the amount of officer time that's been spent on this, the Chief Executive has called a halt. So when that information is provided, that the matter should have been dealt with. I think you'll agree it's been done to death.
You mean the whole issue of 0 hours contracts? Well, I think this is just a specific action point about an answer to a specific question. So if we can get that more information,
and it is being answered, Chair.
Right. Thank you. Social Services and Wellbeing Act. I think that item 14 addresses this, but as I understand there are 2 separate acts, but we'll find out more about that when we get to agenda item 14, I hope. So that's the Audit Committee actions dealt with. Thanks very much. Oh, there are just 2 other things I'll mention as matters arising, if you like. The annual report of the Audit Committee was presented to Council on the 29th of June, as was our report to Council on 0 hours contracts. We did that on 29th of June. So the next item on the agenda then is the review of reserves outturn. Mr. Howcroft.
Thank you, Chair. To give you a bit of reinforced context to this, you'll appreciate there is no physical recommendation being made to the Audit Committee. This is merely about giving you information on which to help you make informed decisions as part of your daily job as members, and understanding about the level of reserves, and increasingly members will get requests from officers to either look to utilise reserves, etc. Well, you can act accordingly in terms of this information that's presented. It comes through in a variety of fashions. Cabinet will get it as part of the periodic monitoring, and it will be seen by Select, but also there's a specific role for Audit to consider whether those level of reserves are appropriate and reasonable. So with that in mind, it's probably best to actually look straight at the resource implications. Effectively, by the end of 2017-18, we will have, over that 2-year period, we will have taken our earmarked reserve levels down by about £5 million, just short of a third. There is probably, whilst there is a degree of replenishment as a result of last year's favourable outturn, we replenished those budgets by 880,000, but it still obviously isn't of the level that we started the period with. As a financial planning assumption, if you were to look at general reserve levels, which is the council fund, we set ourselves as a planning assumption a level of reserve that should be between 4 to 6%. In calculating that, it's currently at about 4.8%. Whilst it's at the low level of that margin, I still think that's acceptable given the fact that the Welsh Government are constantly reminding local authorities in Wales not to sit on excess balances. But what I would describe to you is that our earmark reserves, i.e. those that are set up for a specific purpose in mind, are of a low level and are unlikely to be able to facilitate wide-scale re-engineering of services, which is a flavour of where we are with public sector funding more generally. And at that point, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
So any questions or observations, please? Yes, Councillor.
I don't know what I'm supposed to comment on, John. Items under bullet point 3.2, there's one thing there that I notice has been reserve funding deferred 17-18, and it's the handsets connected worker, and it was invest to redesign. Now, that was put as a very good case for more efficient working, and yet it's been deferred again, and I'm curious to know why, because being practical, I thought this is good policy, this is good procedure, and nothing is happening. So there was that one. And the other question I'd like to ask, on the next table, the insurance provisions at 153,000, that is the money that the council presumably holds because our insurance is dealt with externally, if you like, but we pay a certain, what's the proper term for, we pay the first?
Excess.
Thank you, excess. So I presume that, Chairman, was the 153,000 and everything else was dealt with by our insurers.
Yeah, the provision is looking at what cases we are known to us and actually calculating what basis of excess payment we should put aside for that. So they don't actually crystallise at the moment, and some of those insurance claims may never crystallise in an award. But being prudent, what we do when we receive insurance claims, we look at the likelihood of it and put aside, as you say, our first share of it.
And I can relate back to a long-standing one now. You've explained that to me. Thank you.
If my reserves are only £1,000 out, I'll give you that.
On the other earmarked reserves, 1, 2, 3,
yeah.
4 column along, I printed 1,000.
On your point about connected worker, it is valued by a lot of sections, and actually that's just recognition that actually the capital project that it goes to help afford is actually proving to be a more wide-scale project than we initially volunteered. So actually ring-fencing that money for that particular initiative, even though it will be used in the latter stage of the rollout rather than at the start of the process.
It seems to have been a very protracted process, Chairman.
Does anyone else have any comments or observations on the paper? In which case I suggest that we record that we've noted the paper. So thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is the 2016 Treasury Outturn Report. I think, again, that's Mr. Howcroft.
You may get fed up with my voice this afternoon, I think. For those new members of the Audit Committee, we normally bring the Treasury aspects to this committee twice a year. Once in terms of setting the Treasury strategy, and you'll actually commend that to Council, and then a half-yearly position looking at the update as to where we were. So this reflects the outturn for last year. It gives you a bit of background around our level of investment and borrowing, which is quite useful to you, for you to appreciate. It gives you some context around the external environment, where money markets are generally, what the state of the global economy is, and reinforces our Treasury strategy that we're still borrowing very much short-term and utilising internal borrowing. For those I do apologise with Treasury, it's one of the darker arts of accountancy. We do tend to use rather specific terms. Internal borrowing is that mechanism by where you look at your cash balances, and instead of raising loans, you may very well look to use your internal cash to avoid borrowing. So what we don't do as a strategy is necessarily chase high investment rates, because obviously we adopt a principle of security of investment, liquidity of investment and yield. Instead, what we do is try to make our borrowing costs as cheap as possible. So you'll see when you look at the monitoring report that actually appropriations, which is where these treasury costs are held, are generally underspent to help accommodate some of the financial pressures elsewhere in the council. As part of setting the Treasury strategy, there will be certain prudential indicators around things like the mix between fixed borrowing and variable borrowing, because you wouldn't wish to put all your eggs in one basket. Those are included in Appendix 2, and I'm pleased to say that actually during last year there was no occasions when we actually fell foul of our prudential borrowings, prudential indicators that we'd set ourselves. We do have Treasury consultants. As I said, it is quite a specialist field that help us with the Treasury strategy. You will come in contact with them probably in October, because they are prepared to come in and give you some training, particularly for the new members that will explain to you all the ramifications around Treasury strategy and things like technical terms like bail-in regulations, and even explain the inverse relationship between gilts and interest rates. So you'll be experts by this time next year. I've also taken the liberty of including the SIPFA self-assessment return. I wasn't proposing to go through it today because you've got quite an exacting agenda. What I would like to do is to leave it with you to take away personally over the summer period, and perhaps in the September meeting, if it's okay with you, Chair, facilitate a considered view as to where our skills lie and what additional development needs the committee has more generally, so that we influence Arlene Close when they come in October, if that would be okay.
Sounds like a viable plan. On looking through that part of the information provided, the self-assessment form, I thought probably the committee comes out of it fairly well. The main area of uncertainty to me is individual councillors' familiarity levels with the whole treasury management concept. So I think it's a good idea if we do reflect on that between now and September. Are there any other questions or observations for Mr. Howcroft? Yes, Councillor Feekins.
Just one question, really. So if you're going through structural change, can you put that in as a capital expense and then borrow money against the capital expense as opposed from cash flow?
Capital definitions normally relate to assets. There are 3 fairly stringent tests in terms of whether it enhances the value, enhances the life, or enhances its use to the such that re-engineering, redesign wouldn't normally fall into that category. However, there is a specific exclusion that that Welsh Government in their capital directive do allow things like the capitalisation of redundancy costs, where there's a proven case to them and where they're involved in that. So you can do, but what I would say is that historically our capital programme is probably as tight as our revenue position in not having a great deal of headroom to utilise it in that fashion. You'll appreciate that probably our biggest single priority in recent years has been the provision of 2 secondary schools within the county.
Yes.
Because Mr. Hope mentioned, I got a circle round bail-in. Can you explain that to me, please? That was on Table 5, Appendix 1.
The regulations are, you may remember the banking situation back in 2008 where a couple of them had to be taken back under central government control. To avoid that situation again, the government has placed regulation around what happens if a bank gets into trouble. And what happens when a bank gets into trouble is that generally any private investors are protected, and you may very well see in your own life that if you have a deposit with a bank there, if it's to the tune of £80,000, you will get all your money back irrespective. However, for institutional lenders, which local authorities are termed in this case, it would end up bearing part of the risk and the costs of any failed bank. So clearly what you don't want to do is to start putting large amounts of money with banks that are potentially weak. Yeah? So we tend to restrict our cash investments, and that's another good reason why we use internal borrowing and utilise our cash to avoid borrowing rather than putting investments in banks that have a potential to disappear over the weekend, and that's generally when it does happen. And it's also getting increasingly hard to find banks that actually meet with the ratings requirement that we set ourselves as a treasury strategy, because clearly we want to maintain that principal sum. And obviously the relative worth of these banks is reflected largely in eroding ratings. So we do tend to put money with banks fairly short term, largely to mitigate that risk.
Any other questions or observations? Just one thing, Mr. Howcroft. In Appendix 2, page 30, we see that the capital financing requirement has increased by 20.5 million. I believe that reflects specific actions of the council at the present time, but would you just like to give us a little bit more information about why that's gone up?
The capital financing requirement is that element of capital expenditure that's afforded by borrowing. So if you pay for things by capital receipts, if you pay for things by specific grants, it doesn't increase your capital financing requirement. Why it's important to us accountants is that we end up paying something called a minimum revenue provision. So depending on what your CFR is, you will pay a percentage of that off in terms of simply instead of your debt charge payments. So it's a prudent measure in terms of making sure that actually your CFR doesn't get too high. Through 2016-17, you'll all appreciate that council is the body which decides what gets added into the capital programme, and during the year it decided to increase the capital programme for its future school spending, which was back last October. It decided round about Christmas time that the case for solar farm investment was persuasive and put a further 4.5 million in on that. And we've also, in terms of replacing vehicles that have come to their end of their life that were previously leased, it's actually proved to be more cost effective to actually buy those outright. So those three elements combined raise the CFR by 20 million. It's not an imprudent aspect per se, but obviously we keep a track on it. It's one of the factors that is key in our treasury strategy, because if you keep seeing that going up every year without the headroom to be able to repay that through the MRP provisions, then it is concerning. But at the moment, it's a sustainable prospect.
And of course, we are concerned about sustainability, so we can identify which projects it's going towards, then I think that's a satisfactory answer. Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, just for information for members, Chair, that investment in the solar farm seems to have been as good as we thought it was. My latest information is that it's churning out electricity hand over fist, and it's turning out to be quite a good investment indeed. So long may that continue.
Right, thank you for that. Well, if there are no further questions or observations about the Treasury outturn report, I note the recommendation that we note the results of Treasury management activities and performance achieved in 2016-17. So I resolve that that's what we've done. So we now turn to the next item, the 120 odd pages of the draft statement of accounts. as a prelude to the audit process, including the annual governance statement. Now, Mr. Howcroft, I believe there's a presentation that we're going to have on this. Do you want to start with that?
That's quite right, Chair. I do have a presentation in front of you. It has been circulated to all members, but I'm kind of hoping I will be able to get it. There we are. As if by magic it appears on screen. So, yes, I can only apologise for 120 pages. I appreciate it's a patent cure for insomnia, but unfortunately the statement of accounts does require us to present information in a consistent fashion with 21 other authorities in Wales, and actually there's a lot of amalgamation up to whole of government returns. There is quite a degree of jargon in there which is specialist in nature. Where possible, we've tried to adopt a plain English stance to it, but some of those terms are quite specific in accounting nature. That means that they are reported in that fashion. Those long-standing members of the Audit Committee may recall that in past years I've tried to do a 1 or 2 page summary of the 120 pages of accounts and never really done justice to it, to the extent that I've not received a great deal of queries from you around that. What I would hope to do instead this year of providing that 1 or 2 pages is actually give you more of a familiarity around how that statement of accounts is presented, so that actually I'm growing your knowledge and experience and confidence to ask some of the questions on the statement of accounts that are avoided, if you like, in my 2-page summary. So without further ado, I'll probably track through those slides. Now, there are 40 slides. I'm not intent to go through them in detail. I will just focus on the more important and specific aspects. So please ask questions as we're going along. I mean, looking at the numbers, there's some very key areas in the accounts. I'll look to probably highlight that, but if you've got any queries once you've looked at that 120 pages, if you're able to ask them today, that's great, but the audit process does carry on until September period. I'm quite happy to take those away separately or have a chat with you independently if that's preferable. So, the myths and legends that you need to be a qualified accountant to understand all this. Well, you don't really. You need to have an appreciation of the accounts, and sometimes those simpler questions that aren't accounting driven are the ones that are the more pertinent ones. So please don't be shy in asking questions. The consideration that producing accounts is a waste of time. Well, I mean, we recognise that in an environment of declining public sector resources, that actually there is a enhanced role for probity stewardship of the public purse, and those accounts do cover off about 150 million's worth of net expenditure from a revenue point of view and 40 odd million from a capital point of view. So they do involve some quite significant transactions. Main differences between public and private sector accounts, well, the main differences are largely around taxation. We don't necessarily have the same regimes around corporation tax, and clearly local authorities have a very favourable regime around VAT and such like. However, going back to Councillor Feakin's point earlier, we are more restricted in terms of what we can spend certain aspects of money on, and particularly things like grant funding is quite specific in nature. Whether in public or private accounts, we're both governed by the International Financial Reporting Standards. Sounds very grand, but effectively it's a measure that looks to provide certain conventions and guidelines for all accountants and professionals to follow, and the standards that they expect. Alongside that, we have the work of CIPFA, which is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting, that will actually look specifically at a local authority accounting code of conduct, and both of those will influence how the statement of accounts is prepared. One key dimension that is often a bit of a challenge to accountants is through the year when they look at forecasting for you. We try to be precise and as accurate as possible, and whereas the statement of accounts actually has a slightly different test to it. For a statement of accounts, it only actually has to provide a true and fair view. So you'll see that things like estimations, etc., will crop into a statement of accounts, which we try to avoid when we're actually giving you our advice on forecasting through the year in the management accounts. Similarly, WAO colleagues will actually have a look and set things like what they term materiality levels, that they will look at things and say, well, this could be different, but actually if the consequence on your accounts is not material, they'll be volunteering it in their paper on the outcome of the accounts, but they won't necessarily insist that some of these things will change. So you're actually looking at a lower level bar in relation to preparing a statutory statement of accounts than we try to achieve in relation to our monitoring report to you through the year. I won't talk about proper accounting of statutory provisions, but effectively what we're talking about there is the difference between cash accounting provisions and crystallising of expenditure, etc. So if we get into statement of accounts proper, a statement of accounts is designed to give electors, members of the authority, employees and other interested parties clear information about the authority's finance. They aren't an easy read by definition, I acknowledge that, but actually the format is such that they are to try to provide a consistency of approach between us and other local authorities, and therefore if you looked across the local authority sector you would see very similar tables, albeit the amounts would likely change. So the accounts should answer for you what the authority's services cost in the year, where did the money come from, and what was the effect on the authority's assets and liabilities. So effectively that's stewardship and custodian role. The primary statements, comprehensive income and expenditure statements, that's effectively the profit and loss for the council for the year. We'll look at the movement of reserves, and obviously between this and the cabinet reports you're probably sick of me reporting the reserve position and the doom and gloom of it, but the balance sheet, which is reflected of the assets and liabilities of the council, and obviously the cash flow statement for the year, which is obviously impacting upon our treasury considerations, because you'll appreciate that we borrow for the purposes of cash flow rather than particular projects. And then in supporting those, you'll actually see that there'll be references in those main statements to notes, and at the back of the statement of accounts there'll be supporting tables to actually show where summary information is disaggregated into its various breakdown. So the options for the local authority, I've suggested that the format is quite constrained. You do have options around the order of it, the level of detail, even the use of terminology, presentation, starting point. That's probably the biggest single difference is around the AGS at the start of the accounts will be very specific to that local authority. And obviously Audit Committee will have had a role in the past there about actually setting that forward.
But Mark, you just mentioned AGS. That's the annual governance statement?
That's the annual governance statement, which isn't auditable per se, but it gives the auditors a good understanding of the control environment in place in which the statement of accounts is being prepared. So it can be used to provide financial performance and budget comparisons, and it will tell you about reserves. You will get a lot of that information through the year, so there should be no surprises in the statement of accounts that you wouldn't have heard earlier. What we do here, the comprehensive income and expenditure statement, the purpose is to show the accounting cost of the year in providing services. It's effectively split into two halves, the top half being the service income and expenditure and the bottom half being other income and expenditure. So just to give you for instance, car parking income that you talked about earlier would appear in the service income part of it, but things like interest receivable, etc., or those sorts of income sources, not really a service income aspect, would appear in the bottom half of the report. And there's a sample there that actually shows you how the I&E looks. So you'll get directorate levels, and it shows you that it reconciles the expenditure and funding analysis in note 11.1. So were you to refer to that note, then it will actually cross-reference. Okay. So possible questions on the I&E. What significant income or expenditure changes have occurred between financial years? Because you'll appreciate that this is largely revenue expenditure, so pretty much the services should be comparable between years, albeit we are taking about £5 million out of our revenue expenditure every year as a result of the public sector financial settlements. You need to reassure yourself that you understand why those variances have occurred, whether there's anything that you need to recommend in terms of whether they need to be addressed. and what actions the authority needs to take to address them and by when. And part of that will also be influenced through the audit process in terms of the feedback that the auditors will give you in the September meetings prior to the draft final statements being considered by you again and then recommended to Council for endorsement. I'll skip over the budget comparisons. So, movement in reserve statements, that's fairly self-explanatory. What it does to do is looks at the start of the accounting period, what changes have occurred through the year and what the end position is. The main difference between that and the reserve paper that you saw earlier is that I exclude things like unusable reserve, things like pension fund reserves, etc., which aren't accessible. But clearly in this it's a very sizable difference because there's a large deficit on the pension reserve. Possible question on the movement of council fund balances. Our council fund balance between this year and last year has stayed the same. You heard earlier that we manufactured an £880,000 surplus. Whilst we haven't put it into the council fund, what we have done is topped up 4 earmarked reserves that you saw in the paper earlier. So effectively, the council fund stays at the same level, but we've just replenished those earmarked reserves in those areas that we think we're likely to incur pressure. So things like IT costs, redundancy, investor redesign. Okay. So where the expenditure and funding analysis reserves. I think we've spoken in quite detail about reserves and about how you should view the council fund as effectively our war chest for anything that's unforeseen to happen. It is at the lower end of our acceptable financial planning window that we've set ourselves as a council, but I think that's right and proper given the financial environment that we face. Your key question around the balances and the reserves going forward is whether you regard those balances to be adequate. And that's the same whether it's through the statement of accounts report or whether it's through the periodic reserves report that you receive quarterly. Might be useful explaining the difference between usable reserves and unusable reserves. I've said that there are 2 sorts of reserves there. I regard there are 3 sorts of reserves. Effectively, you've got your general reserves, which are made up of the council fund and school balances. You've got earmarked reserves, which are those where you decide to set aside particular money in particular war chests for particular purposes. And there are unusable reserves, and probably the best example of that is around the pension fund, which the council hasn't got the ability to utilise in a fashion that it does the other 2. So, unlike those stories where you see more scrupulous private sector raiding pension funds to afford things, I mean, those are ring-fenced and are actually, the administration of those are part of the Greater Gwent Pension Fund and are not actually held within the local authorities' accounts, although what we tend to do is show our proportion of it in our statement of accounts and consolidate it. And that just explains a bit of the definitions around usable reserves and unusable reserves. So you can see there how the reserves are shown in the balance sheet: council fund, earmarked reserves, capital receipts reserves, which is the level of capital receipts we currently have on our books. That's reported to members quarterly because you'll appreciate that actually future schools spending predicates £30 million worth of capital receipts. We don't currently have that in at the moment. That's not necessarily a problem because we don't need it right now. We're using Welsh Government's first, but actually we're starting to get to the period where actually we're using our contributions. So actually it will be an increased focus for this council that actually the reserves it set itself to generate we will need to achieve now in the timescales that we've set ourselves. Okay, yeah, those are statutory accounts there, which explains some of the the specific reserves that are required to be set up under statute. So we need to set up a pension fund. We have to have a capital adjustment account and a revaluation reserve for any changes in capital value of our assets, and also an accumulated absence adjustment account. I appreciate that's a bit of a mouthful, that last one, but that's a measure of some of the technical terms that are used that we can't really explain it in any different fashion. Possible questions. Do you understand why there have been changes over the accounting period? Do you understand what the impact of those changes are likely to be on future policies and headroom for the council to be able to do things that it might like? And are the level of usable capital and revenue reserves at the financial year robust enough to deliver future policies or manage emergencies? Cash flow statement. Well, that shows the change in cash and cash equivalents since the last balance sheet and this one. I've said there it probably has more prominence in the private sector than it does in the public sector. I think that's probably right. We tend to use our cash flow, as I said, largely as a treasury consideration. It's a very little operational context to service managers out there that are managing a budget, because they're not looking at see what receipts we've got in and can spend. It's very much a consideration in a dark room there to make sure that we've got sufficient funding in our bank account to afford what we want to do. And that shows you the example cash flow statement. Again, fairly standard approach in terms of starting the year, working through the adjustments, and then showing the end of year position and what the overall consequences are. Possible questions for you on the cash flow statement. Is the council's net cash flow position for this financial year for the whole authority in line with the authority's treasury management predictions? Well, interestingly, you've just had the Treasury Outturn report. The prudential indicators suggest that we've managed that cash in line with the Treasury strategy, so you should be reassured there. If the net cash flow position of the authority for this financial year has not been in line with the above, well, what actions is the authority proposing to take to bring that cash position back in line? That's a flavour of how you should be thinking and the questions you should be either asking us or officers, or asking Cabinet in terms of their management of the overall financial situation. And there are some reflection points for members, so probably consider the purpose of each part of the financial statements. Ask yourself, what is this telling me? Do I understand what it's trying to impart? What areas are important to know as a member, but also as a stakeholder in the Council's financial affairs? Some of you may very well sit on various committees, etc., but at all parts in your life, I guess as members you're expected to understand all aspects of the Council's accounts. So actually having an understanding of some of this background information is probably quite useful when you're dealing with your surgeries and being able to put a value to some of the activities that the Council's incurring. Yeah, you can ask what issues were raised at last year's audit letter. Have they been actioned by the authority? Are the financial messages of the budget monitoring reports consistent with those in the final accounts and forward? You know, judging whether there's a consistency of argument there being proposed that there's a further squeeze on council funding, and is that reflected in the situation? I mean, just as an anecdote, we could be saying, well, woe is the public sector financing, but by the same token, if we're then raising reserve levels to the extent that we're building up very sizable balances, well, that's an inconsistency there that you might want to inquire about and challenge as members. How do the final accounts fit with the authority's latest medium-term financial strategy? I appreciate you haven't got that in front of you. For those new members of the Audit Committee, that process normally starts around about the September-October time and goes through till January, and considers the budget strategy for the next 4 years. And again, you'll be wanting to look that the outturn statements are consistent with those messages that are provided to you. We can always do better as accountants in terms of our choice of language, and we will often slip into technical terms just because we understand them. Please pick me up on those if you don't understand them, and I can either explain them or try to, in future, make the accounts simpler. On that score, we're always looking to make the accounts more readable. I mean, in the last 3 years, we've actually taken 30 pages out of the statement of accounts. It's still 120 pages, but you can appreciate the motivation. We are, 2 years hence, have to take 2 months out of the statement of accounts process collectively between audit and accounts. So there is a motivation to actually make those statements even more refined. That may very well mean that there'll be some amalgamation of notes. That will mean that there will probably be some increased use of estimations going forward rather than specific aspects. All in the environment that the accounts have to provide a true and fair view, not 100% accuracy. So there are some choices that the council can make around simplifying its statement of accounts that we're actively looking at. The challenge for us is obviously, by the same token, if we make a note that's rather general in the accounts, is it sufficient to someone to understand the situation, or does it need to be more comprehensive? So there's always that juxtaposition in terms of trying to shorten the accounts from also trying to explain the situation. And the key takeaways for you are probably that the financial statements are a highly technical document, but I hope that that we can grow knowledge, expertise and confidence to ask questions, and there is no such thing as a silly question. As I said at the start of my my discourse, it's normally the simpler questions that are more difficult to answer, so please challenge me with it. Best practice requires members to debate and engage with the financial statements rather than just simply accept them. Please ask questions about the statements. It doesn't mean that you don't trust the finance department. And you generally don't need to be an expert accountant to understand that. We're there to actually help you either in this forum or separately in terms of understanding and growing your knowledge. And just a bit of humour to finish with in terms of accountants are being human, talk to them. It says, were you always a troll? No, it happened when I came to accounting. First my hair fell out and I stopped going to the gym. But you have horns and a tail. When I realised I had a look going, I just went with it. Ask the trolls in accounting to explain this charge. Please don't make me talk to the trolls during budget season. Next. And on that humorous vein, I'll happily take any questions.
Okay, Councillor Feakins.
Two questions. Thank you very much for that. Very informative. Do you apply any internal rates of return when you're borrowing internally? That's one question. And then secondly, when you've got things down like the solar farm, which is obviously a big, significant capital expense, are you amortising that capital expense over a period of years, or are you writing it off in year one? And if you're writing off in year one, how do you then work the cash flow coming back out of that project?
Okay. We don't... If we look at projects, we may very well look at an internal rate of return. We don't actually charge a rate of interest for using the cash that we've got. We're effectively just looking to make the saving against the borrowing costs that we're avoiding. So, for instance, I think in the Treasury report, we suggested that actually if we were investing money, we're largely getting from the money markets between 0.35%, 0.45%. If we were borrowing that equivalent money over 3 years, it's probably about 1.5%. So effectively, we're making of the order of 1% saving, which we actually derive in our revenue account. If we were to charge the equivalent of an IRR in it, then effectively that would negate that, and we actually need our savings and headroom within revenue to afford some of the challenges around social care and health that are a financial challenge to our annual budget. On the second point, yes, we do amortise costs over the life of assets. In relation to solar farm, my recollection is that would be 20 years because that's normally the life of the equipment that will expire. What we actually chose to do there was in modelling the business case that, and I appreciate it came to Cabinet before you remember, is that we put together a business case that was on the side of prudence. So we looked at what the equivalent borrowing rate would be at PWOB. That's the, for those that don't know, the Public Works Loan Board. It is the borrowing agency that the public sector can access at probably preferential rates to the market, which would be our backstop position. But we then further outperformed the borrowing on the solar farm by actually taking an interest-free loan from the Welsh Government's Salix scheme. That means actually there aren't any interest, which allows that business case to outperform even the business plan assumption that we set ourselves initially.
Can I ask one more question, if I may? Just regarding the schools then, when we're spending significant amounts of cash on the school, does the property, does that become an asset on the balance sheet per se, and is that written off?
In relation to the two secondary schools, they will become assets on the balance sheet, and we're considering what the appropriate useful life for those assets are, but at the moment, meeting with estates and property colleagues, they are between the order of 50 and 60 years and will be depreciated accordingly. I was specific in suggesting those two secondary schools will be on the balance sheet because we have three categories of school within the council. Those that are wholly owned by the council, those that are voluntary controlled, and those that are voluntary aided. And generally the distinction between those latter two are that there is a religious denomination to them. And Leslie will help me out here, but I think it's in relation to voluntary control. Our interest on the balance sheet is simply restricted to the playing fields. Actually, the asset itself is actually owned by the diocese. Is that right?
For both voluntary.
Can you
Yeah,
can you
possibly,
just repeat that with the light on, so it's for the live stream.
Okay. Yeah, for both voluntary controlled and voluntary aided, the main asset is not on the balance sheet, possibly with just the exception of a playing field, which is a small part.
Councillor Feekins.
Sorry, just one quick last question then. But there's no, just regarding that on the schools then, there's no tax implications then whether if it's devalued or decapitalised over a period of years. There's no tax implications for us of its present market value, as it were.
We don't have the same context around capital gains and capital losses that the private sector does. We do have a periodic revaluation, which is every asset on the council's balance sheet is re-looked at every 4 years. Some go up, some go down. That is actually adjusted through the revaluation account, so that effectively that's our holding account for any movements. And obviously, when there are subsequent valuations, if they go back up, then the first port of call is to wipe out that first entry into the revaluation account. It effectively avoids the volatility in local authority accounts that you might see elsewhere.
Right, I'm just looking around for any further questions or contributions. Councillor Smith, is it? Can you switch your microphone on, please?
Pardon, yes. The reference to the Monmouthshire Farm School Endowment Trust, that the Llanelli Hill one, and then 3.8 and 3.9 also make reference to other charities or funds that we manage. Is it appropriate for the council to actually be managing these funds? They're small issues, but they're big issues, and in that there are various bodies around Wales, and I can't recall the body which actually maximises the benefits of small societies all combined together, and I can't remember what it's called. But I've often wondered, it must be very, very time-consuming when it comes to the accounts for the council to look to these, and is it an appropriate role for us?
the main charities are the ones that are in the that I've identified around Llanelli Hill and Mom Farms. Whether it's appropriate or not, actually the conventions go back into the midst of time in terms of creating that trustee, and actually I found in other authorities I've worked, it is very difficult to break that trustee status, because there's no one usually that's better placed than the authority to act in that custodian type fashion.
Must come back to me, Chairman. It was the community fund which extends over Wales. Am I right?
I'd be surprised if that were an entity that would oversee charity. You've got the charity commissioners. A fund suggests to me something whereby there is access to resources.
If I could help, going back in the midst of time, because I've been here so long, we did used to have quite a few very, very small charity accounts, which we did transfer. We did manage to get them transferred, as you say, into that community fund. We haven't done these. These are more substantial charities, and at the time I think members weren't comfortable with transferring those into that community fund, but we have done it in the past. I'm not sure about whether it still exists or whether it's still the same name, I mean, but we have done it in the past.
Right, we'll just looking around for any more contributions or questions, just noting that we are required to review the draft statement of accounts as presented for audit, and also that we should review the draft statement of accounts for the Monmouthshire County Council Welsh Church Act Fund, which I believe you just mentioned. So, yes, Councillor Strong.
Could I declare an interest? I'm on the panel of the Welsh Church Fund, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Well, I think after that detailed introduction, and in the knowledge that we can all of us get back to Mr. Howcroft at any point if we've got any further questions about the detail in these accounts, I think I'll suggest that we have technically reviewed the papers. Yes, Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think that's right, but taken in the context of the fact that the figures are all well known to members anyway, because they've been through the full scrutiny round. At least the old members would have seen that. So if any of the new members want to look at it in more detail, take up Mark's offer.
Actually, I've got one for you now, Mark, which is we seem to have unusable assets which are negative, unusable reserves which are negative. I understand, of course, that this is the pension fund. I've been around long enough to know that. But can you just explain how we could have a negative reserve, please?
It is a bit of an anomaly if you regard it in relation to how you look at other reserves, but effectively the pension reserve looks at the level of liability that fund has for its members in relation to the contributions being made, and that's why it's in a negative situation. It's not unusual for our proportion of this fund to be in a deficit. I don't know many pension funds that are actually in a positive. Over the next 3 years, there will be an uplift in the contributions that the employer makes on behalf of its members. It is less problematic having an open scheme than a closed scheme. Perhaps I can just explain that. At the moment, anyone that comes to work for Monmouthshire County Council is quite entitled to join the Monmouthshire Pension Fund. A number of schemes have closed, and where they are closed, they are not receiving those contributions from new members coming into it. With an open scheme, whilst there is an inherent liability there, it's actually current members that are paying for those liabilities as people retire now, that will be replenished in due course as they retire. The problem crystallises more with a closed scheme, and actually there is more of a need to resolve the situation. As to whether it's sustainable or otherwise, I think mine's immeasurably superior to mine. We'll be looking at terms and conditions of local authorities, 1% pay awards, etc. from central government, and look at the whole terms and conditions balance for public sector and sustainability more generally. I don't know whether that helps in terms of perspective, but the other thing I would say is that when you look at the liabilities on a pension fund, they crystallise at one particular point in time. So they will look at the 31st of March as to what shares, etc., are taken out in relation to that, and it will reflect that day's activity. The next day, the market may very well change, and actually when you look at the pension fund notes within the accounts, one of the sections there is around sensitivity analysis, because pension fund accounting is quite sophisticated. They make predictions about how long someone will live after they've retired and what likely call they will make on that fund, which can be quite different. They will also make assumptions around things like the raise in the share income, etc. So whilst there is a paper loss on the unusable reserve, I'm not sure it's the reality, but I acknowledge the fact that actually pension funds in the public sector generally aren't fully funded.
Well, thanks for that extra information, but we've got some questions now.
No, another question, just a comment. Thank you for clearing something in my mind, because it's what I term a working fund. It's actually invested, whereas there's another authority that it isn't. You pay in and it just sits there, which seems a bit daft. But thank you for asking.
Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. The pension fund, I'm just checking, it's a DBS, a defined benefit scheme. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right, without any further questions or observations, I'm just going to say that we've carried out what we've been asked to do, which is to review the statement of accounts and the Monmouth County Council Welsh Church Act Fund. So I'll move on then to the next item on the agenda. Yes, of course, Mark. Thank you very much. Which is going to be the Internal Audit Outturn Report. So do you would like to introduce that, Mr. Walton?
Thank you, Chair. Today I'll be presenting two of the most significant of the internal audit papers of our audit year. The first of these is the Outturn Report on internal audit activity for the 2016-17 financial year. This report has two main objectives. First, to provide feedback on findings of the audit work completed during the year. And secondly, to give a commentary on the performance of the internal audit team. In terms of our audit work, we are set up as an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve the organisation's operations, and in particular, risk management, control and governance processes. To do so, we work in line with the public sector internal audit standards. And one requirement of those standards is that the Chief Auditor produces an annual report giving his overall opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's internal control environment. And this is the required report for 2016-17. At the start of the year, we amended our system of classification of audit opinions as shown in Appendix A. These now more clearly identify the levels of assurance we conclude can be gained from each audit. We have four categories now: substantial, considerable, reasonable, or limited. Based on the audit work completed during the year, Andrew's opinion as Chief Auditor is that overall the internal controls in operation provide reasonable assurance, meaning adequately controlled, although risks identified which could compromise the overall control environment, improvements required. This overall opinion has been arrived at based on the 28 individual audit opinions given during the year, and for information is broadly in line with the previous year's findings. The full list of audit opinions given for the year is set out in Appendix B of the report, not C as incorrectly stated in paragraph 4.1, so apologies for that typo. Overall, there were 8 limited assurance opinions during the year, and these are listed for information at paragraph 4.3. In respect of the limited assurance opinions, then we will be providing regular reports to committee on such limited assurance reports, and will continue to give details of such audits and of our work to review the implementation of action plans agreed with operational managers to address the risks identified in each case. Each year we allocate a proportion of our resources for special investigations and unplanned work. In the last financial year, we were tasked with a total of 12 such jobs, as listed at paragraph 6.2. These cover internal investigations, new risks that emerged during the year, and unforeseen work, such as verification of new grant claims submitted by the authority. We also provide advice and guidance on the interpretation of legislation, local authority policy and procedures to all departments across the authority. As shown in section 7 of the report, team members are encouraged to undertake appropriate professional training and also to engage with auditors from other local authorities in audit practitioner groups to share learning and best practice. In terms of the team's performance for the year, our performance indicators are set out in Appendix C of the report. Overall, we delivered 75% of our plan within the year, which was just under our target of 80%, and the remaining work is being completed in the early months of 2017-18. Our performance in terms of timeliness of reporting and the completion of jobs within planned time has improved from previous years, but we still feel that there is scope for further improvement in these areas, and Andrew and I will monitor that throughout the coming year. On a positive note, we are pleased to report that 98% of audit recommendations made were accepted by our clients during the year. And in addition, we achieved 100% satisfaction rating in our clients' questionnaires returned. For the first time this year, we've also included at Appendix D some of the commentary received back on those questionnaires from audit clients, which I hope will give a flavour of their perceptions of our work. That's what I wanted to say by way of introduction of the report, but I'll gladly take questions.
Right, questions and observations, please. Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think I know the answer to most of this, David, but on the ones with the 8 with the limited classification, we've seen quite a lot on most of those. What sort of progress is being made with regards to finalising your reports and picking up any new ones that are on there? So when we've done the school dinner money, that's come to us. We've had a look at mobile phones, and we've looked at the Bribery Act. You know, just general background to why things are still in a limited context.
Okay, if I just say a very few words on each of those then. This is at paragraph 4.3 of the report, the 8 limited opinions. In terms of the school dinner money system, members may well be aware that we are currently implementing parent pay, a sort of online payment system for school meal income throughout our primary schools. That is currently being rolled out as we speak and should be finished before the end of the current academic year. We will be looking again at a follow-up audit to assess the implementation of the parent pay system sometime in the autumn once the schools are back in session. In respect of Ysgolafin, we have agreed to do a follow-up audit of that school I think the date agreed off the top of my head is in December 2017. We'll be going back into that school, and obviously we will update members once the follow-up work has been concluded. What I would say is obviously we have agreed action plans for each of these reports, and managers are working their way through those, managers and head teachers. Sorry, Councillor Easton. Okay. In respect of events, as I alluded to before, we are already looking at our follow-up work on events now, and members will be aware that there is a series of events coming up, well, imminently now at Caldicott Castle. So we are working through that. Obviously conscious that officers are very much tied up with plans for those events in the short term, so that's why we agreed there to come back in September once there's a little more breathing space to get the information that we need from them, and hopefully we'll also be able to give a little bit of a first look back at this year's events that are taking place over the next couple of weeks. Policy review, that's actually in respect of in particular people services policies. So things like the employee code of conduct, whistleblowing policy, etc. Again, we agreed an action plan with Sally Thomas on that, and she has already made progress there. I believe a number of policies have recently gone through Cabinet to address some of the recommendations that we've made. Issues there were in particular about making sure that these policies are subject to regular review and update and reflect any changes in legislation or best practice, etc. And again, we'll be looking to carry out a follow-up audit of that in the current financial year. External placements, exactly the same really. We have agreed, that was quite late in the financial year, so we have agreed an action plan there, and a follow-up audit of that will take place again in the current financial year. Compliance with the Bribery Act, the final report on that is just being issued this week as we speak. And again, we've included, as we'll come on to in our next reports, the audit plan for 2017-18. We've agreed an allocation later in the year to review the implementation of the recommendations there. Volunteering, that was one of our larger reports of last year. The flavour of the findings there was that we generally had quite a good framework of policies and procedures in place for volunteers that had been developed centrally. Most of the issues we identified there was then in the application of those policies and procedures by the various departments spread across the authority. So we'll be working as part of the action plan there in making sure that officers who do have a responsibility for managing volunteers are getting the training necessary on those policies and are there in a position to ensure compliance with those policies in the work of volunteers across the authority. And also as part of that, there was an issue identified whereby we also looked to maybe begin to differentiate between different classes of volunteers, because you'll appreciate some volunteers are working with us on an almost daily basis and perhaps dealing with some, working with children and vulnerable adults, etc. So they are of a much higher priority in terms of risk and making sure compliance with policies, etc. Whereas other volunteers may only participate maybe in one event a year or something like that. So we're looking to establish a way of differentiating the different requirements depending on the nature of volunteering work that is done in each case. And in respect of mobile phones, once again, an action plan has been agreed, and there is an allocation again in the current financial year for us to revisit that. We've recently moved to a new contract in terms of our mobile phone provision across the authority, and we'll be looking at what impact that has had in terms of the audit recommendations when we come to do that follow-up. So all I can assure members that all of these are very much on our radar and will be reflected in our plan as the next report will demonstrate.
Thank you for all that. Any other questions for Mr. Walton? Yes.
Not a question, it's a comment that in your list somewhere there was only one high priority, one real anxiety, the corporate, where were we? Page 76, cross-cutting the corporate capital programme was deemed as the high-risk area. I can understand that. Can I ask, please, Chairman, as members, we're advised that we have statutory to provide something like 600 services. These are a statutory requirement, so we're doing a lot. How do you actually select the items that you're going to work upon?
I'll be coming on to that in the next paper on the audit plan for 2017-18. So if we could maybe hold that thought, and I'll pick that up shortly.
Right. Any other questions or observations? In which case, I suggest that we note that we've endorsed the outturn report from Internal Audit. So that leads us on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Internal Audit Plan for 2017 and 18. So over to you again, Mr. Walton.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so our second paper today is the final audit plan for the 2017-18 financial year. This updates from the draft plan that was reported to the previous committee in March, following further consultation with senior managers and also the end of the 2016-17 financial year. Now, back in 2011-12, actually, we undertook a very comprehensive risk matrix planning process, which identified over 300 possible audit subject areas across the authority. Each year we revisit that matrix, considering other information sources, such as, in particular, the authority's current risk register, any emerging issues identified from new legislation, changes in operational structures and practices, and the implementation of any new systems. We also consider performance data from the improvement plan, the work of the Wales Audit Office, and any slippage from our own work plan from the previous year. Once we have considered all of that, we classify each potential audit as high, medium or low risk, and allocate our available resource to cover these risks as best we can. We do prioritise high-risk areas, obviously giving most of our attention to those areas and ensuring that they are all the high-risk areas are covered each year. But we do acknowledge that it's important to include some low-risk audits each year, and there are two main reasons for that. The first is to ensure that low-risk areas receive some audit coverage, at least periodically. Otherwise, there'd be a risk that certain areas were never looked at and never given any scrutiny. And the second reason is to enable those inexperienced members of the team to develop audit skills and knowledge in a relatively lower risk environment before progressing to medium and higher risk work as they develop the necessary skills and experience. In respect to the plan, each departmental management team across the authority was provided with a copy of the draft plan for comment. And in addition, Andrew and myself have attended numerous DMT meetings and individual meetings with DMT members to discuss the draft plan. The plan recommended for acceptance today has been refined in the light of the comments from the consultation process. And whilst resource restrictions mean that we cannot provide coverage of all risk areas across the council, Andrew and I are confident that this plan allows us to deliver a balanced programme of audits across the authority, sufficient to meet our duties under the public sector internal audit standards and statutory legislation. Okay, that's by way of introduction to report. Again, I'd be happy to take any questions on the plan itself.
Over to members then. Questions or observations? I'll just kick off with one then for you, Mr. Walton. Do you think you have sufficient resources for the plan?
Yeah, as part of the planning process, we do a calculation to work out the number of days. I'm pleased to say that at the moment the section is fully staffed. We have a full establishment. Hopefully, long may that continue from my point of view. And based on the calculation of available resources, with that in mind, then we have developed a plan to be achievable and to provide the necessary level of coverage in accordance with the standards.
And then there is always the issue of unforeseen work, isn't it, which can arise during the year?
Absolutely, Chair. That's a very good point, and to an extent that will be a little bit out of our hands. Although we do include an allocation for special work and unforeseen work, history tells us that in some cases even one major investigation can be enough to make a big impact on our plan. But where that happens, obviously we will be bringing back quarterly progress reports to this committee to keep you abreast of any developments there and of any potential slippage. So I think we can look to take that forward through the year through means of those reports.
Thank you. Councillor Smith?
I'll follow on from your question, Chairman, because you said you were fully staffed in the department now, 5.4 equivalents. But under 4.4, where audits planned were unable to be undertaken during the year due to insufficient resources and the effects are enough of unplanned special work. My question in my mind was, do you have enough staff to actually do the work that we should be doing?
What I would say is, if we had more staff, we would do more work and we would provide more assurance. But I think, in fairness to my colleague managers, I think probably most managers in the authority could say something similar in respect of their workloads as well. So, as I say, we're satisfied that we can provide coverage to discharge our duties under the standards and legislation. Obviously, if we had more resource, we would do more work.
Councillor Higgins.
Yeah, that's the point. I wanted to come doing something could crop up, and you met 75% of your target, and okay, so, you can look at that whichever way you like. But if you've got one or two unplanned issues, if I put it that way, that you need to look at it and urgently at that, then that's the net effect of it. But at least it's ongoing. So you even though you might not meet the 100%, it will be part of your ongoing work, won't it?
Exactly, Councillor. That's very true. Just to re-emphasise, where we haven't met any audits from the previous year, they will always be rolled forward into the next year's plan, so they won't just be forgotten about. We will always roll them forward in that way and make sure the coverage is provided.
Councillor Feakins.
Thank you very much. Will the prior to you going off and doing the audits in these relevant areas, will you come back to us and ask us for scope, or is that also left to you now? Basically, is the scope defined by yourselves, or is that defined by us?
In terms of the scoping of the individual audit assignments, that's normally done. We normally hold meetings with operational managers and use that to sort of explore various issues in their service, and then we will develop the scope as the audit team ourselves. We don't normally involve members in that. Were we to do so, I would just have a concern about whether the impact on timeliness of the work. It may cause some slippage there.
Okay. Any other questions or observations? Well, in that case, I suggest then that we accept and endorse the 2017-18 internal audit plan. Thank you very much. The next paper, agenda item 11, is a progress report on the Welsh Audit Office proposals for improvement. This is a Monmouthshire County Council paper, so I'm going to ask Mr. Jones and Mr. Gatehouse to introduce their paper.
Well, settled in. Thank you for that, Chair. So just to introduce myself, I'm Richard Jones, Policy Performance Officer within the Council. Here today to present the progress update up to June 17 on the Wales Audit Office proposals to improvement issued to the Council. And this is built on an update that's previously been provided to the committee 6 months previously. I really want to take the opportunity to bring new members of the committee in particular up to speed with the work performance audit work programme, and then also take any questions you may have on progress as well. So to give you a bit of background, each year Wales Audit Office undertake a performance audit work programme in the Council. I believe that was set out to you in the last meeting. Each piece of work is reported back, usually within a report, but sometimes in another format. And within those reports, generally they can make 4 levels of interventions for areas where they think we need to improve. And those are set out within 3.1 of the report, and they range from proposals for improvement, which are generally lesser seriousness, up to recommendations that ministers and Welsh Government intervene, which are obviously higher level of intervention. The report for you today relates to proposals for improvement only, and they, in my experience of working for the Council, the majority of issues which we get reported on. There are a couple of current recommendations from the Safeguard Arrangements Kurgaffer Scheme report that have been reported separately to Council and not within this report today. So all the proposals are just proposals for improvement in the report. The work that informed the proposals has come from the corporate assessment undertaken by Wales Audit Office in March 2015 onwards. And the corporate assessment was the last real comprehensive assessment of the Council's performance processes undertaken by Wales Audit Office. And this covered things like vision and strategy, governance accountability, use of resources, collaboration and partnerships, and also managing improvement, performance and outcomes. And obviously since that piece of work we've addressed some of the proposals, so you won't see them on the paper, but also we've had follow-up work and other work programmes, so new proposals have come in. An example of some of the areas which Wales Audit Office have focused on include human resources, performance management, IT, and also governance arrangements, and previous members of the committee will be familiar with those coming through over the last 12-18 months. So in terms of the progress, the report, as I said, builds on the progress that reported in December 16. You will see these 6 monthly coming through so you can track progress. And it also brings in any new actions from any new reports that have been issued since the last time we reported progress. Appendix 1 contains the open proposals for improvement. And open proposals for improvement are those where we still require work to address the issues that need to be addressed. And in the report you will see each proposal in Appendix 1 has the report that was issued as well as then the nature of the proposal about the area we need to improve. And sometimes those can be more than one, where the issues that we need to improve are closely linked. And it also sets out then the progress we've made in addressing that proposal and any future actions, timescales and responsibility holders to address that proposal we've committed to. Appendix 2 of the report contains the closed proposals for improvement. And closed proposals are where we've deemed that we've taken sufficient action to address the proposal. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the proposal will not be a continued focus, it's just that we've actually deemed that through the evidence we've got that sufficient action has been taken and that will not be then included in any future monitoring arrangements. And broadly we've structured them into a few key areas. There's a lot of different reports and a lot of different areas covered by Wales Audit Office under the Performance Work Programme. So 3.9 you can see some of the areas we've structured this report into. So we've got human resources, performance, partnerships, governance, finance and information technology. In terms of access for members of the committee to the source reports, I'm conscious there's quite a lot of reports referenced, and we have now set up one document library on our intranet, the hub, and there's a link to that within the report. So that'll enable members of the committee to go back to the source of the report and see the wider context in which those proposals were issued, and also our initial management response to the proposals we issued to and agreed with Wales Audit Office at the time. And that will include the 2 subsequent items being presented by colleagues of Wales Audit Office as well. And one final thing to mention, coming forward to you in the near future, will be a summary document produced by Wales Audit Office in the annual improvement report, and that will give you a summary of all the work they've undertaken in the year. So that'll be a useful document coming to you probably after the summer, I think, for you to consider. So that's sort of the background and a bit of progress. So I have to take any questions, Chair, on the report.
Right, well, I will now throw this open to questions and observations. I'm not going to put the Welsh Audit Office on the spot for a response, but you're welcome to chip in if you've got any comments you wish to make at this stage. But do we have anything about any questions or observations on the progress report? Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, the point I'm coming to is that there might be something within the WAO report that refer to what we have from our own officers, and I just that's my view, and it might not happen, but the thought I have is if it could come, it might things we've that in Richard's report might be a source of comment from the WAO. So you might or you might not.
Are you referring to the papers we have today, Councillor?
The one following on from the...
Right, well, maybe. I didn't read it quite like that, but maybe.
Thank you for that, no, it's helpful just to really reiterate that. Obviously there will be links in terms of Wales Audit Office will make the links with follow-up work, with work they've already done previously, and we will factor that into our response as appropriate, so we'll link those to previous work that has been undertaken. So that's why there will rightly be the overlap with some of the work and the references to previous work.
Yeah, I might have worded it better, but yeah.
And it does look like an ongoing process from where I'm sitting as well. Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting, Chair, too, that this is a little bit more up to date than the WAO reports because they're inevitably more historical. They couldn't be anything else. But you know, this is a far more up to date. The only question I would have here is are there because as usual, Richard, you've got an awful lot of information here, and all of us who have read it will have already been able to answer an awful lot of our questions. Is there anything in here that you think we're particularly struggling with at the moment, or is it all work in progress, shall we say?
It's a good question. Obviously, it covers a variety of areas, and what I'd probably reflect on that is when judging the progress, we look at 2 key things. We look at the progress we've made against the actions in terms of timescales, so are we on track? But also importantly, not just so we delivered those actions, are those the right actions to actually then impact and actually address the proposal? So is the evidence that that actually has been the case? So if we look at the update, there's some which have been on the update now for coming up to 2 years, and that might be likely because there may be some more difficult issues that will take longer to resolve, and some of those may be quicker issues we expect to resolve sooner. So I think some of the timescales would be key for members to consider, and that's how we look to judge them and consider them as we progress. And I think if you take sort of the human resources proposal around staff engagement and staff values as a good example really of that, the proposal sets out, the first one on Appendix 1, the progress we made in terms of implementing talks and holding staff conferences. We've undertaken a staff survey recently, and the results of that survey what staff have told us will determine whether we've been successful in actually engaging wider staff and ensuring those values are evident. And if that's the case, we will probably remove this proposal from the paper. But that doesn't necessarily mean that won't be an ongoing focus. And if the results say actually that hasn't been the case, we'll keep the proposal on there, and there'll be a reconsideration about the actions we are taking. So some of those longer term proposals are ones probably particularly members may want to focus on, but that's the sort of judgment we look to take. There's no probably one set answer when we look across the variety and range of proposals in place to how we judge them. It's a combination of factors.
Yes, Norm. Okay, any further questions or observations? Councillor Watkins.
Just a very quick one. I see a reference to check-in, check-out. And as a new member, I don't actually know what that is, so could I be enlightened, please?
Quickly, check-in, check-out, it's basically staff appraisal process, which is effectively undertaken a formal check-in, take out a staff appraisal at least once a year, and they sort of set guidance around some questions that should be asked and lead to some objectives for the individual and also any learning development needs, etc. So it's our term for a staff appraisal. And I'm sure coming forward to you in the near future will be some more information around our human resources processes that will refer to it, so you'll see a little bit more about it.
Any other questions or observations? Right, okay then. Well, then I suggest that we note that the committee has considered the current position on proposals and future actions being taken in response. Well, we've considered it as set out in the paper, so I'll duly note that the paper has been considered by the committee. So I'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Wales Audit Office Savings Planning Report and the Council's Management Response. So I think that's for Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll just quickly take you through this with a sort of high-level overview, if you like. I'm assuming that the report was being read. It is a relatively short report. This forms part of our performance audit work programme. It's the third part in a staged series of work that's been done around financial resilience that's been done right across Wales, so it's not unique to Monmouthshire. Just a few areas that I was just going to focus on. If you turn to page sort of 5, it just gives us sort of the background to the review. It explains that we carried this out sort of back end of last year. A lot of the work bulk of the work was done between June and September, and it was mainly to identify looking at planned savings and whether they were going to be delivered. So what we looked at was the extent to which some of those savings plans had been delivered in 2015-16. And at that point in time, what the position was in respect of 16-17, whether some of those savings were likely to be delivered. What we did, we sampled a number of savings proposals and looked at some of the underlying assumptions, see whether there were adequate mechanisms to ensure they could be delivered. We also touched on some of the work that we'd done previously and followed that up. Just reflecting back to 2015, just briefly, we concluded that there were generally effective sort of governance arrangements around financial planning and control, although there were areas that did have scope for improvement at that point in time. I think if we then go to page 3 of the report, that sort of gives you the sort of high-level overview of our findings. And just in respect of sort of 15-16, the planned savings were going to be delivered. So we were satisfied there that the arrangements were adequate. In terms of 16-17, at that point in time, 83% of savings were going to be delivered. And delivery timescales for some savings we found were unrealistic, so weren't going to be delivered by the end of the year. And I think that transpired to be the case at the year end. I suppose that's not totally uncommon in terms of, you start the year, you have a plan, you make various assumptions, and by the time you get to the end of the year, then things may have changed, things may have taken longer to implement than you originally anticipated. So it's not unusual in a sense, but I suppose in that situation, what you would expect is some sort of backup plan in terms of, well, there are other things that could come online or proposals to draw on sort of reserves or contingencies or whatever.
If I can help the Chair, they were accepted as additional questions.
Thanks for that.
So then in terms of our overall conclusion, we concluded that there was a well-structured approach to sort of budget setting, but what we found was that, or what we felt was that longer-term financial planning arrangements were hampered really by a medium-term financial plan that we felt was underdeveloped and may not support future sort of financial resilience. And that's the issue really that led us to make a proposal for improvement, which is around strengthening that sort of financial planning arrangements by developing the medium-term financial plan that incorporated a little bit more around sort of the reserves policy, how that sort of fitted into the medium-term income generation, fees and charges, that sort of thing. Whilst there were policies in place and there were things that we were shown as part of the work, they didn't seem to be considered at that point in time when the medium-term financial plan was being considered and how that was being reflected in your sort of policies going forward. And also the sort of future Monmouthshire project, although that's a sort of strategic document, obviously we would expect you to look at that and consider the implications of that in terms of what future developments there are likely to be, any sort of reconfiguration of services, etc., and how that's going to impact. No. Yeah, so there's an interrelationship there between the two documents. So I suppose that was our overall position, which led to us saying that, and that would lead to sort of a more robust medium-term financial plan. There is an argument to say that why have a medium-term financial plan? You very much plan on an annual basis, you get funded on an annual basis, you find out what your main funding is going to be from the Welsh Government a few months before you start planning for the sort of the following year. But clearly, it is important to have that longer-term view, model sort of assumptions, what's going to happen with inflation, what pressures there are, other sorts of things. So that is really best practice to do that. And I think
just to interrupt again, Chair, it was lovely when we used to have indicative settlements. We used to have much better medium-term financial plans then.
Yeah, and I think as well, sort of linked to that is the fact that you have not got a lot of headroom in terms of reserves and balances. You don't have a big pot of money. You think, well, if we don't deliver, we can always draw on that. You know, you're relatively limited. You know, referring to Mark's earlier paper around reserves, there's a large element of reserves that are earmarked, and then your council fund balance is at a level that you would expect to be held at year on year to deal with sort of unexpected things and emergencies that you hadn't planned for. But once you've used that, you know, your scope is restricted again. So, you know, that was our overall feeling around that there was more to do to develop that, and the council did accept that position. And the timetable for that is a completion by March 2018, presumably as part of, you know, reiterations of the medium-term financial plan. Those things would be brought in more in the future. So that was those were our broad findings. That's a fairly high-level sort of run-through, so quite happy to pick up on any specific areas or take any questions.
I just start with the recommend a proposal for improvement, which was accepted apparently by the County Council. So improvements to the medium-term financial plan will be considered as part of the budget setting process. Do we have anything more on that?
Yeah, if I could just make a few comments in response to the WAO's report. As you say, Chairman, our official response is on page 223 of the version of the report. And I'm pleased that the WAO has recognised that our medium-term financial planning was an improved position on the 15-16 process. But I recognise that we do have some more work to do on it. And key to developing a robust MTFP going forward, and what we've recognised, one that will serve the council well, is to align it with the work that we're doing under the Future Monmouthshire work stream. And we have updated our MTFP, and members that came to the induction sessions will have seen seen that MTFP. And whilst it's not balanced, what it does do at the moment is provide that future Monmouthshire work with a projection of the sort of resources the council will have available to it over the next 4 years, so that when future Monmouthshire looks at what the future of the county and the county council should look like over that period, it can make a realistic assessment of what it can and can't achieve over that period. So as Terry said, it's not unusual across Wales. They've done this piece of work across Wales and come up with similar proposals for improvements for other councils where most authorities, I guess, across Wales could do with some more improvement in this area. And the overall national report across Wales did say that MTFP was improving, but not delivering fast enough to ensure financial resilience. And I guess I concur with that view. I would like us to move faster and get proposals in quicker and have a better 4-year programme. But as I said, it needs to be aligned with, members' wishes in terms of the future Monmouthshire work.
Thank you. Questions and observations, please. Well, if nobody's got any burning issues they wish to raise, I suggest then that we note the report and note the County Council's response. So I'll move on to the next item, item 13, Welsh Audit Office, good governance when determining significant service changes and the Council's management response. I think this is for Don Jenkins to introduce.
I accept what he was saying, but it's a situation that is continually reviewed by the monitoring officer as, you know, would you agree? Can I come back? So I picked out in there, the Constitution was reviewed and in 2014. And so what you were saying in effect is since 2014 the changes that are taking place are not reflected in it.
Within the council, it is difficult. There's a continual rolling ball, and it is very, very difficult to identify who, what, and where. I think it's also important that members are involved in that thinking. The options that are available are proposed by officers. They need the full picture, and you can get useful contributions then perhaps to help the council.
Thank you very much. As is usual with papers that originate from outside the council, I'm going to ask for a management response first. So probably concentrate on the 5 proposals for improvement, and then I'll take wider points and questions.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So if I'll sort of pick up on the management response to this one, and thank you, Non, for the report and the summary of it. I think probably we recognise as an authority that we're dealing with change probably on a scale and pace that public services haven't really had to deal with prior to the current time. And with that, we need to keep on top of these sort of governance and decision-making and arrangements. So we recognise the issues within this report, and probably one that's happened with the new administration now is the creation of a new post-cabinet member with responsibility for governance. I've met with Councillor Jordan, who set out some of his expectations around this, but also in terms of some of the issues set out here in the management response around reviewing our arrangements for decision-making, for report writing, to enable you as members, but also other officers in the council, to be able to really see at any one point where the key decisions were made, not only the point at which they enter the select committee agenda or are seen on a council agenda, but that point of inception where ideas came through in the officer realm, where decisions were made at DMT. And if you look at things like then how the consultation section of the reports are structured, that actually you don't just see who a report has been considered by, but actually what those key views were and how they shaped up the report. So what we've recognised is a number of issues where as a council, to reflect this increased pace of change, we need to change our own arrangements, and that's something which as officers we've been tasked by the chief executive with doing. And hopefully what you should see after we've been working this up now over the summer months is a change in some of how this is structured from sort of September onwards in terms of that clarity of report. Now, we need to consider some of the mechanisms around that sort of tracking of decision making, whether we can make use of existing technology like the modern gov system, or whether there are alternative things we need to consider, such as SharePoint, but to enable people to have their sort of pulse on the finger of that sort of decision making. And you know, we know that sort of going forward with, you know, as Norm mentioned, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act now, huge amount of challenge there for all public bodies, but actually for us and how we work. So Welsh Government have repealed the old sort of, or are currently consulting on repealing the old legislation and guidance that underpins performance management. So that'll throw in some challenges there for us. And you know, also, I mean, I guess it's new work for yourselves, isn't it? Wales Audit Office, a new ways of working, which we're all still grappling with because it's a fairly groundbreaking piece of legislation. So how do we actually track and monitor on a quarterly or 6 monthly basis complex societal challenges that we may be grappling with, which is a little different about sort of monitoring and measuring some of the process and output sorts of measures which we've historically been addressing. So big challenges ahead. We're up for them. We recognise the need to amend our processes in response to a lot of the issues we see here. And it's a case we're working on it and hope to sort of be bringing things before members in the not too distant future to spell out a little more of the detail there.
Thank you for that, Mr. Gatehouse. Questions and observations? I think Councillor Easton wanted to get the first question in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We receive regular reports from you, the Wales Audit Office, and generally it seems to me as we take 3 steps forward and somehow take 2 steps back. One topic in this report where we don't seem to have really grasped what we ought to be grasping is the alternative delivery proposals. That's a big service change. You've picked up certain aspects within that I think members may have picked up as well, but we don't seem to be, from my perspective, going on the right direction to resolve that service change. Am I right in reading your report in that way? It is a matter which is going on for 18 months or more. Hopefully in September there'll be some final decision, but we'll have to see.
Do you have an immediate response?
No, I'm not sure I'd be the best person to offer a response in terms of closeness to that agenda. But I'm very aware that in an earlier item, you have Ian Saunders, I think, coming before the committee, and it may be that Ian is better placed to give you an update around that work.
All right, okay, thank you.
I just want to make sure we can follow up on that. When is Ian Saunders coming to the committee? In September. So we need to put this question before him so he's able to answer it.
We need to put this question before him, but we're also mindful, so I understand, is that we look at the authority, Monmouthshire County Council, we're looking for a decision in September. Is that still the case, or that September we move on somewhat? Because I can't see us meeting Mr. Saunders before we make a decision, or that close to make a decision. I think that the two things would be a bit too constricted.
Chair, if you're okay with this, what I was suggesting is perhaps after the meeting I catch up with colleagues, understand the latest position, and perhaps write to you with that, and then inform a decision of whether that's an appropriate timescale given other factors.
That would be helpful, thank you. Councillor Higginson.
No, thanks, sir. I picked up on the point you just made, and that satisfies me. Thank you.
Any further questions or observations on the papers and on the presentations? If not, then I'll just say that we've noted the report and the MCC response. Yep. Okay. Next item on the agenda is progress on implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Is that for you, Matthew?
Yes, thank you very much. And I noticed sort of earlier on there was some discussion also about the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So the item as minuted was to give an update on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I think probably through the training sessions that have been offered to members, both have been updated, but very conscious with the number of sessions that members have been required to attend. Not everyone will have been able to attend everything, but just so people are aware of the sort of broad difference. Both are acts with well-being in the title. Both are relatively new, and probably one way to think of them, although this is not the most technical definition, is that the Social Services Act is very much sort of focused on the well-being of individuals, that sense of worth we have as individuals. And if people would like these, there are two essentials guides which the Welsh Government publish. Both are sort of 8-page, easy-read versions of those. So if it would be of interest to the committee, I'm happy to get both of those sent round. We also have lots of resources.
Yes, if you could do that, please. Yeah.
On the hub. So that issue notwithstanding, if I give the committee a sort of brief overview of where we're at with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is improving about the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Monmouthshire, of Wales and of our communities. Came into effect.
Matthew, do you just want to press your button again and get the camera back on you, I think?
There we go. Normally, people like to move the camera off me, and no, he's sort of sweating. Normally, you sweat under interrogation in the committee, but today it's just the sheer heat of things, and hope it remains as such. But yeah, so it's the one thing to bear in mind with this act as well. It places responsibilities on all of the 44 public bodies in Wales, but also on the public service boards. So there are different responsibilities. So as a county council, we have to set well-being objectives every year. So the previous council set those by the 31st of January. Now we did those based on a well-being assessment, which I'll come to in more detail. The Public Service Board has some additional responsibilities, and that's around preparing a well-being assessment, which will be familiar to sort of many members that were with the council for the last administration. We did that as part of a big exercise which we called our Monmouthshire. Now, those responsibilities are overseen by the Public Service Board Select Committee. So I think probably as Audit Committee, you can satisfy yourselves that the scrutiny of the responsibilities placed on the Public Service Board are adequately picked up elsewhere. And as a committee, your remit around the arrangements of the local authority need to focus on the responsibilities placed on us as an individual public body and our responsibilities under the Act. So it's about the Sustainable Development Principle, which is set out in terms of para 4.2 of the report, page 243 of the bundle, which is about looking to the long term in terms of our decision making. The Act sets out 7 well-being goals, so it's about taking an integrated response in how we meet those. So if we're doing something, for example, on transport, we consider other aspects. You're not just looking at the social aspects of transport, but also what that can do in terms of a prosperous economy, or in terms of the sustainability of the area. It's about involving a diversity of the population in decision making, collaborating with other public bodies, and perhaps very importantly, and where this Act has a very strong overlap with the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, is in terms of taking a preventative approach, looking to act to solve problems before they arise. And as we know, with some of the problems we're grappling with financially as well, actually earlier intervention and stopping problems happening is far more cost effective than waiting for them to happen and sort of, to use a commonly used phrase, almost sort of parking the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff rather than putting a fence at the top. So just sort of working through sort of the progress that we have made to date. Going back a couple of years, Monmouthshire County Council was an early adopter of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and we worked with Wales Audit Office there around some of the governance arrangements, and they made some recommendations early on. And I've hyperlinked to the report there. I don't propose sort of revisiting all of that because it was a number of years ago. But one of the things they spoke about there was ensuring that people within the organisation had absolute clarity on the Act and what it meant. So one of the things that we did over the subsequent period was run, I think, 3 different member seminars and training sessions where we actually worked with members at that time to develop the processes and actually sort of test them out in a live situation. So, for example, as you're asked to make decisions as members at council, you will see that all reports that require a change in decision making have a future generations evaluation as part of them, which incorporates a sustainability assessment and a quality impact assessment. That was done in response to those findings, but also learning and working with groups of members, testing that out, trying to run one process, changing it in response to feedback. So quite a number of staff and member seminars to communicate that Act and also involve people in embedding the processes that we need to change it. I mentioned briefly the well-being assessment that we undertook, and again the links to this are within the report, and it's led to the publication of a well-being assessment. Again, it's a PSB responsibility, but a really important piece of evidence for us as a county council as well, because that sets out some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing our communities. It was developed with sort of fairly extensive engagement, but also looking and using data sets, academic reports, and future trend information of what we could expect to happen around the county. And that was used to set the 4 well-being objectives for the county council that I mentioned. So the next steps for us in terms of a council are really, it will come back to the individual select committees, but in terms of then monitoring our progress against those objectives over the current year 2017-18, Now, as members, you haven't seen a report with detail yet underpinning what we will do in response to those individual objectives. And that's simply because of the timing of that. It's a bit of an oddity of the Act, but even in election year, you have to publish these things by the 31st of March. So we sort of had to publish things about 3 days before council was dissolved and a new set of members elected. But it's just one of those things with the legislation. 4 years out of 5, it makes sense. In election years, it's a bit of an oddity. So we're working on this at the moment. You'll see some more detail coming through after the summer, and then as members, particularly those members on select committees, you'll have the opportunity to scrutinise that detail. As Audit Committee, we bring a regular report to you, I think every 6 months, outlining the effectiveness of our improvement arrangements. So as Audit Committee, you will have an update on this Act as part of those arrangements, where you'll get an overview of it. But as individual members, you'll be involved in terms of other committees which you may sit on. And as Council, you'll be asked to make a decision annually on the improvement objectives that the Council sets. I think in terms of what I've included in the report, that's the bulk of it. Just for you to have by means of context, there are links in there to the full statutory guidance if you wish to view it, or you can pick up the phone or drop us an email and we'll answer your questions, because there's quite a bit there if there's anything specific you come across. Appendix 1 of this report is a diagram called the architecture of the bill. So it basically tries to put the whole Act on a page. And in fairness, it doesn't do a bad job. Faced with reading the legislation or looking at the one-pager, I'd look at the one-pager and give us a ring if there's any questions. We know a lot of it. If it doesn't, we'll look it up to save you looking it up. And so, Chair, if that's adequate in terms of an overview, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks for that. Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for all your work you've done so far. It's a lot of work that's been imposed on the PSB and also you as a council. But it's like the audit officer said earlier, it's about measuring the outcome. How do we measure the outcome on such a wide range of issues over such a long period of time? What's your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really complex one for us, and I think it'll depend in certain places on some of the challenges that we adopt. So at a national level, as part of this Act, Welsh Government have set out 46 wellbeing indicators. Some of those are better than others, and some you can see the impact of individual public bodies more than others. My honest assessment is probably they won't tell us as much as we need to know, or as much as you as elected members will wish to know. And the reality is, I think, with the sorts of challenges we're facing, the traditional numerical things probably won't tell us a huge amount for quite a degree of time. It will be about the milestones. So one of the challenges that was surfaced in this wellbeing assessment was one of inequality between and within communities. Probably issues that all of us can recognise. You know, from the outside, Monmouthshire is perceived as leafy and affluent by those that perhaps don't know it terribly well. But once you get up close, there are an awful lot of pockets that you don't necessarily see in the headline statistics. So, you know, issues like gender pay differentials, big male-female earning gap within Monmouthshire. Now, that's not going to be closed overnight, and it's not going to be closed by actions of public services alone. So we can track it and monitor it. Our individual influence on it will be only part of a wider picture. So I think what we'll be in the position of doing is bringing forward a number of milestones to say, you know, we have kind of what the academics often call a theory of change. If we do A and B, we expect C to follow. So we'll set out a hypothesis. We'll say we intend to do this. We'll monitor whether we've done it and then track the numbers. But I would say it's not going to be perfect. There will be time before we start to see any shift. And to be honest, if the Act is worth its salt, actually we're addressing challenges that are not easy to measure. Because actually, if we could do them easily, we wouldn't need the Act in the first place. This is about sort of radical transformation and sort of complex societal issues. So I can't sort of honestly put my hand up and say, you know, I think we've got this cracked. I think we've got a big challenge ahead of us in terms of monitoring it. But it's a challenge we relish because it means as a public body, as a public service board, we'll be focused on the important challenges.
Questions and observations? Councillor Higginson.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just, excuse me, thank you, Matthew. There's an annual reporting issue attached to this. How often do you have to respond to the Commissioner?
In terms of have to, I mean, there are sort of, the Commissioner, to be fair, we have a very open dialogue with the Commissioner's office. So, for example, I went into their office yesterday and we had a fairly informal catch-up, a couple of hours, a cup of coffee, and we said, this is where we're at. Because this is a new piece of legislation for them as well. One of the approaches the Commissioner is taking is not a sort of heavy-handed you must. It's a can I, as a Commissioner, support you at public bodies to transform the way you're doing things. So all the messages we're getting at this point feel to be the right ones. Now, the legislation sets out some fairly definite statutory timescales. So at the moment, we've just started what's called in the legislation a 14-week consultation period with the Commissioner about how we will shape wellbeing objectives for the Public Service Board. So what that meant is we put a document together which will be going to the Public Service Board on the 25th of July. We sent that down to the Commissioners and we said, can we come down, have a cup of coffee and just chat through what this means? So it's a regular dialogue. There are some statutory points in the process, some more formal than others, which we have to go through. But actually, you know, that Commissioner relationship in our experience so far has been an incredibly positive one, rather than one that creates work or bureaucracy around the Act. Who knows? I may be saying something very different in 12 or 18 months, but right now it feels a very supportive, engaging relationship.
Any more?
Last Chairman,
yes.
going back, it's the requirement legally is once a year, twice a year to the Commissioner.
Well, we have to produce we have to produce an annual report on the wellbeing objectives. Yeah. But what I would say is, at a time like this, when we're developing the assessment for the PSB, there's a lot more contact points, but it's formally one report per year.
Any further questions or observations? Yes, Councillor Feekins.
Just very quickly, there's no requirement on us to be measuring our outcomes at the moment from Welsh Audit Office, or there's nothing in place or going to be in place, some sort of framework at the moment?
As things stand, that is in discussion. So in the autumn, the Auditor General and the Future Generations Commissioner held a joint workshop, which I attended along with the Chief Exec, where they spelt out their intentions. Now, one of the things they're waiting for is for Welsh Government to repeal a bit of legislation dating back to 2009 on how we have to measure performance. And at the moment, that hampers the way Wales Audit Office have to audit and regulate us. It almost requires quite a short-term sort of mindset, which sometimes butts up against the intentions of the Future Generations Act. Once that's removed, it will free their hand a little, and currently those discussions are ongoing between the Future Generations Commissioner, Welsh Government and Wales Audit Office as to the framework that replaces it around the Act. As officers, we're not sure on that picture as things stand, but we're led to believe discussions are ongoing and we can expect something in the future period.
Councillor Watkins.
Hi, thank you. The other thing that the Wales Audit Office mentioned was that the views of stakeholders and reflecting that, and obviously I know from the work that you've done and the presentations that you've got lots of views from stakeholders, you've been out in the community gathering them. I'm assuming then that this is one of the ways in which we're going to bring those views through in the reports that come through and the work for the Future Generations Act.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So within the wellbeing assessment we produced in response to that, we set out a lot of the stakeholder views that was received and published, I think, a sort of 3 or 4 page summary of the views that came back. And actually, interestingly, individual sort of officers of the council and other public bodies have asked for a copy of the detail because there were a lot of individual service issues there, which perhaps, while not informing the wellbeing assessment, were very important for council services. And actually some that do inform the wellbeing assessment remain incredibly important. So, for example, one of the issues raised in throughout communities was one of problems with affordable housing. And that came out across all generations in terms of, you know, can young families afford to stay and live and work in Monmouthshire? Now, for Mark Hand, our head of planning, that's incredibly valuable evidence because, you know, there will be a wide range of views in any planning committee on any given proposal. Actually, a wealth of evidence saying there is support within the community across the board, in principle, for building at a level which enables families to live and work locally, is important policy context. So that sort of evidence that hopefully will keep on giving back to us. But yes, so it comes through in the wellbeing assessment, and what you will see then is in terms of the objectives that the PSB eventually choose in its wellbeing plan, you should see what the community have said reflected back in the sorts of issues that are prioritised there. And, you know, in response to what Wales Audit Office said, your question, we need to make sure we're explicit so that people can see how their views have influenced that plan, rather than sort of do it in silence and sort of say, well, we know as officers, but we're not telling you.
Any other questions? Well, in that case, I can conclude that we have been able to develop our understanding of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I will move on then to the next agenda item, which is the Forward Work Programme. I don't know if anyone has any questions about that. If not, I'll just note that the date and time of the next meeting will be the 19th of September 2017, and please note it's a Tuesday, because I think it's been brought forward a couple of days because of the timetable on the accounts. Thank you, everybody.